We're in project scope management, and this video clip is on the process control scope. Control scope is part of the monitoring and controlling process group within project scope management. And the definition of control scope or scope control is managing changes to the scope baseline. Now remember what the scope baseline is. The scope baseline was approved as part, with the approval of the project plan, which contains the scope statement, and strictly speaking, the scope baseline also includes the work breakdown and the work breakdown structure dictionary. Project managers everywhere and always recognize the concept of creeping scope or scope creep. Even if they haven't actually learned the term, they recognize what it is. Creeping scope is where it's, as PMI says, it's uncontrolled expansion of the scope and without adjustment to time, cost, or resources. And usually it happens in small increments. Your customer asks you for something and it seems like a reasonable request and it's only small, so you do it. Or your technical team builds in something a little extra into the scope. In fact, we call that creeping elegance. Tends to be scope creep if it's generated by your customer. Tends to be creeping elegance if it's generated by your technical team. And in both cases, as I say, it's a small growth. It doesn't seem like much, but you may find that at the end of the project, your scope may have grown 30%, and you've also then, so you've lost control of the scope, and then you've also lost control of your time and your cost. Now, there's several different varieties of scope creep or creeping elegance. One is discovery work. Discovery work is something that you discover in carrying out your original scope. For example, one of my projects has been a personal kitchen renovation, and you can imagine that the kitchen renovation is replacing the cupboards, replacing the appliances, and related electrical and plumbing work, but it does not include any change in the flooring. And you agree on that with your spouse, and you start the project. So discovery work. You tear out the old cupboards, you find the drywall in behind it is in bad shape. That drywall's on an outside wall, you tear out the drywall, you find there's no insulation behind it. So then you have to put in the insulation, a vapor barrier, and the drywall. The scope has grown. It's going to take more cost and more time. What about quality enhancement? Well, quality enhancement would be adding to the quality of the finished result. I have quality in quotes because that depends on the viewpoint of the various stakeholder. So let's say you're out buying your kitchen cupboards and your spouse says, oh, let's get cupboard doors with glass in the front rather than particle board. So that's an increase in the scope. It's probably not going to add to the time, but it's going to add a little bit to the cost. And then there's other types of scope growth. For example, again, you're in the middle of your kitchen project and your spouse says, oh, while we're at it, the floor looks ugly, let's replace it. Well, you thought you already had the scope defined as not including replacing the floor. I've got a couple of other real industrial examples to tell you about. I was in a project where we were converting a linerboard mill. Linerboard is a kind of cardboard used in corrugated cardboard. We were converting a linerboard paper mill to a newsprint paper mill. And the project was approved. We were well underway. We were dismantling some of the equipment, ready to rebuild it, and we found that these huge 5-foot diameter cast iron gears, a number of them were cracked. So it took significant time and expense to order custom-made gears to replace the several that had been that were broken, to our astonishment. Another example, so that would be discovery work. A quality enhancement example is a cereal plant expansion that I was on, and it was the client had the policy at the beginning of the project that they said the following. Look, they said, when we do cereal plants, when we do food plants, we usually finish every room in the whole plant to food quality standards. It's a fine level of architectural detail where there's no shelves or lips upon which dust can gather, and it's a very smooth surface on the walls, and it's a very clean surface on the floor. But they said, we only need to do that in the food processing rooms. We're going to, for other rooms in the plant expansion, we're going to go with regular industrial standard. Well, that was fine. Project got underway. And then every 3 weeks or so, every 2 or 3 weeks, we'd have a visit by some client representative from their head office, and they'd come into a room that was a non-food processing area, and they'd say, oh, you can't have that architectural finish. Oh, we've got to flash that in. Oh, you're going to have to put epoxy paint on those walls. So essentially, by the end of the project, all non-food areas were up to food quality, and it was significant extra expense to do it on the fly like that rather than build it in at the beginning. And I admit that we in the field office were not outspoken enough about reminding them about what their policy had been at the beginning of the project. So, what to do about this? Answers to it, well, for discovery work, more initial investigations. You know, explore behind the drywall in your kitchen renovation to find out about it at the beginning. You still have to do it, but at least you won't be surprised. For quality enhancement and for scope growth, things you can do, well, try to have a clear, unambiguous scope at the beginning. Try to get people to sign off on it. Have a process for changes so people recognize, client people particularly recognize that if they want something that's extra, that there is a process for approval for that, and it may involve more time and money. Sometimes during a design phase, we can show clients and users prototypes on a screen or a 3D model or a paper model so they see what they're going to get, so any requests they have for additional scope at least comes up during a design phase rather than a production or development or fabrication phase. Make sure your technical team is aware of the scope so that your technical team may in fact be building in creeping elegance. So make sure they know what the scope is. So they're not going to automatically build it in. They'll discuss it with you first. Here's another story. I talked to a lot of registered land surveyors, and every registered land surveyor has the following story. A client, a homeowner or a small commercial client will phone them up and say, I need a survey of my land. And the surveyor's team would go out and they'd survey the land, and then they'd contact the client and they say, okay, we finished surveying your land. We found 3 iron bars. We replaced another iron bar. We're all done. Here's the invoice. And then the client says, well, what about a drawing that you're going to give me? And then the land surveyor will say, well, it doesn't include a drawing. Well, don't let surprises like that come up to the client at the end. So instead, surveyors, when they get contacted and somebody says, I want a survey, the surveyors will always say, what do you need it for? Because the surveyor is an expert as to what kind of survey you need for various applications. So they explore and they find out early what it is that the client needs and helps the client understand what they need. So a reminder about the triple constraint that if you can't control your scope, if the scope grows, then it's very likely the cost and time are also going to grow. Now, there is in your course notes a scope change workshop page. I'd like you to read that workshop, and I suggest you pause the video for a few minutes, read that page, and think about what actually happened here. So, this is an example of creeping elegance. Your designer had a good idea for scope enhancement or quality enhancement by designing in-water plantings in the stormwater retention pond. And the client and the other stakeholders like a conservation authority, they all like the idea, but they want you to change the selection of plants, and therefore the side slopes have to change on the stormwater retention pond. This creates more work for you, because originally you weren't even contracted to do the in-water planting. So this creates more work for you. Now let's assume that you're on a fixed price contract. You'll be incurring extra costs without getting reimbursed. And it can be a little embarrassing to say to the client, well, you weren't supposed to have that in the first place. We'll just go back and give you no in-water plantings. This is only a small story with a small impact, but it is typical of scope enhancement or creeping elegance stories. In fact, this story came from an actual corporate client of mine. Make sure your technical people know what the scope is and communicate with you before they initiate scope enhancement like that. Now, here's a question. Why bother, if you're the project manager, why should you bother to document and approve changes in the scope? Now, this may seem like an obvious question with an obvious answer. I'd suggest you might pause the video and give a bit of thought to that, and then we'll take up some answers. Well, one good answer could be, so you will get paid, assuming that you're doing this, in fact, on contract for an external customer. It also creates an audit trail at the end of the project. It explains why the project is took a month longer than originally anticipated, or cost an extra $10,000 or $1 million than had been approved. And it provides historical records so that later, for the benefit of future projects, when you're planning the next project, you can look at these historical records, you can look at these documented scope changes, and you can ask the question, hey, maybe we should build these scope changes into the base scope in the next project, so they're not scope changes later on. They can probably be done more efficiently. And also, sometimes clients and client representatives will ask for something orally and informally. Maybe it's not really justified. If you do put it in writing and give it to them for approval, then they're going to maybe think a bit more formally about it. Is there a justification for it? Is there a cost benefit for it? And it communicates the change. Once a scope change document is approved, it usually gets communicated to others, and it's going to communicate that change and its impact to other stakeholders who maybe should know about this scope change. And probably most importantly, it formally revises your cost and schedule baseline. If the scope is formally changed, then you have a chance to formally change the cost and schedule that goes with it. So now, at the end of a project, rather than you being 1 month behind schedule and $100,000 over budget and making excuses saying, remember, back in March you asked me for this and this. Instead, when you finish the project, you're going to be on the cost. You're all going to be on budget and you're going to be on schedule. It's better for you, and it's actually better for the project and for the client. And it may be required. Another reason is it may be required by your contract with the customer or by your company's own quality management practices, such as ISO 9001. So if you do have a scope change request, the sorts of things that would go in it could be, well, this will change from company to company, but typically you may be defining who pays for it. Some scope changes have costs that will go through to a customer. Sometimes there may be scope changes that we, the project, have to absorb ourselves, or we, the performing organization, have to absorb. So make it clear who is paying for this. What is the change? What's the rationale for the change? What is the business case for that change? Importantly, what's the impact on the budget and the schedule? Sometimes we'll also show what's the impact on how the final result will perform. So adding these extra features to a software project, is it going to slow down the performance of that software package? Maybe there's some risks that are going to be generated by this addition of scope. Of course, the scope change can also be a reduction of scope. And sometimes we'll say, what's the impact if it does not get implemented? Well, that's really taking us back to rationale. Now, here's a video I'd like you to see. If you haven't seen it already, I suggest that you pause this video clip, go onto YouTube and watch this 11-minute section of a movie. A movie is based on the development of a military vehicle in the United States, the Bradley Infantry Fighting Vehicle. The project manager of that project, after the project was over, wrote a book about it. And the book is featuring why it took them from 1968 to to 1985 to gather requirements, finalize the requirements, and then the design of this vehicle. Now, the video clip was turned into, this book was turned into a Hollywood comedy, which seems a little amusing. In fact, it is an amusing movie. It has been dramatized for impact, but it's fundamentally a true story. So pause my video, have a look at that, and we'll come back and discuss maybe what could have been done. So you've seen the 12-minute clip. You may choose to watch the whole 2-hour movie. As I say, it is amusing, particularly for engineers and designers. So I don't pretend to be a designer or builder of armored vehicles, but some bullet points here would seem to be fairly clear that in that kind of case, perhaps they should have decided early how to handle the various versions. If they want a base infantry troop carrier vehicle, maybe develop that as a separate product. If they need a scout car or a heavily armored car, maybe those could be other versions built on the same platform, something like the automobile companies do. They could have a gated approach, have gates along the development and have their stakeholders sign off at the gates with an understanding we do not go back to a previous gate without the most senior approval within the client organization, in this case, the U.S. Army. It would seem as though there was not very much, well, it would seem from not only from the movie, but from the book that it's based on, there wasn't enough authority given to the project manager and the sponsor to say to stakeholders, whoa, we're not heading in that direction. We've already passed that gate, and we're going to be moving on. Use a change control process. If there is a request for a change, have a change control process that whereby the change comes to the PM for evaluation, goes to the sponsor, and then can go on to steering committees and so on. Consider an incremental life cycle instead of a predictive life cycle. This would appear to have been a predictive life cycle where all the requirements were gathered, and then the design, and then the building, and then the testing. Consider an incremental life cycle where maybe the base vehicle gets developed and tested, and then the full troop carrier version gets approved and tested, and then an armored version gets approved and tested. And that's the end of our video clip on scope control.